folks, this is Roger Raynard with the final part 3 of 3 of the big lie in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. I'm up to section 10. Here's a document I wrote a little less than 2 weeks ago. You can get a copy of this document at dropbox.com. Go to the folder Free-Fiddle-Workshop with dashes in between. Free-Fiddle-Workshop. Picking up in section 10, I'm going to talk about the days of creation, and I'm going to finish it up with a talk about the elements. So I'm going to talk about the first 4 days of creation. Section 10, what was the universe like prior to the first day of creation? My hypothesis number 11. This is covered in verse 2. The entire universe was just a blob of water. There was no light. That's what the Bible says. There was no space. God was wrapped around this blob of water which had no form. That's prior to the universe creation. Section 11. What happened on the first day of creation? My hypothesis number 12. This is covered in verses 3 through 5. God created light so that vision and sight could be used to sense the universe. Now, day and night, which are created in verse 5, are not the same day and night mentioned in verse 14, because the day and night in verse 5 are capitalized, not the lowercase day and night later on in verse 14. So the most accurate description of day and night in today's terminology is that God created light and dark on day 1. The day 1 dark is only dark through our sight, through our vision. It's not prior to day 1, dark was everything, every sense. So after day 1, there was light, but there was still no form to the universe, and there was still no space in the universe. What happened on the second day of creation? Section 12. My hypothesis number 13. Here's a typo. I say verses 3 through 5, but that's section 1. This is verses 6 through 8 is what happened on day 2. God created the firmament, which in today's technology would be most accurately called a crust. The crust gave a spherical form to the universe, which was still just our planet. The interior of the crust was water. That's what the Bible says. The exterior of the crust was also water. The crust, which was totally submerged under the exterior water, was called heaven with a capital H. And that's the last time you see heaven with a capital H. This heaven is not the same as the heavens mentioned later on. There was still no space, and notwithstanding the lack of space, the form appeared very similar to the water planet in the Star Wars movie. So God created the crust. Pretend my fingers, the thickness of my fingers of the crust, water on the exterior, water's on the interior, but all you could see is water. And he called this crust heaven. Section 13. What happened on the third day of creation? This is covered in verses 9 through 13. God made the continents of the seas. Once again, there is significant wordplay about which to beware. As mentioned previously, now talk turns to the heavens, not heaven, but the heavens, which start in verse 9 and rule the remainder of chapter 1. And it's not the same as heaven mentioned in verse 8. The heavens is not defined in Genesis, so I'm taking that to mean, my hypothesis takes the heavens to mean to extend to the end of God's creation. At the end of the second day, God's creation extended to the exterior waters of the universe. On the third day, God gathered the crust above the sea and called it earth. That's with a capital E, not to be confused with the lowercase earth mentioned later on. That's in verse 10. In today's terminology, earth would most accurately be called land or dirt. Since the waters under the heavens were gathered in one place, there was only one continent. God called the water seas with a capital S, but there was only one body of water. So when in verse 11, when God said, let the earth, lowercase, that's the lowercase earth, put forth vegetation, that was not just the dirt, that was the entire planet. So vegetation was also started in the seas. There was still no space. So on the third day of creation, God took this crust and say my first finger and middle finger are the part that extend above the water. Now we have dry earth, earth above the land, and this is called earth with a capital E. But the lowercase earth would be everything. So now we still have this crust, we have water on the inside, and now we have land sticking up above the exterior waters. That's on day 3. Still no space. Section 14. What happened on the 4th day of creation? My hypothesis number 15. This is covered in verse 14 through 19. God finally created what we call space on day 4. The lights in the firmament of the heavens were the planets, and I'm not exactly sure which planets. God created space so that man could keep track of time. This is mentioned in verse 14. That's why God created space. God already knew how to keep track of time. So space allowed man a way to keep track of time. The lights in the firmament of the heavens that God created did not include the stars, because God did not create the stars until the end of verse 16. So God created the lights in the firmament of the heavens, and then later on at the end of the verse, it says, well, God also created the stars. So the stars were not part of the lights in the firmament of the heavens. Since the Earth's sun is a star, which was not created until the end of verse 16, the greater light to rule the day, earlier in verse 16, was probably the planet Jupiter. But it also could be Vril, V-R-I-L. The lesser light to rule the night was one of the other planets, or once again, it could be Vril. I'm not sure, and if it is a planet, I'm not sure which planet. If our current moon had been the lesser light to rule the night, God would have said so. The stars that were made at the end of verse 16 provide our current signs of the zodiac. But my hypothesis, God did not think in terms of signs of the zodiac. God just thought in terms of keeping track of time. Throughout this entire section on the 4th day of creation, the sun and moon are conspicuously not mentioned by name. At the end of the 4th day, the universe had the same form that we see today, notwithstanding any changes in the last 400,000 years. What we call planet Earth was the center of the universe. I'm a believer that Earth is the center of the universe, just like the Bible says. The day and night, these are lowercase, described in verse 18, are finally the 24-hour day and night unit that we use today. However, the day and night were not defined by the Earth's sun at that time. Now we use the sun to define day and night. But at that time, day and night were defined by the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, which were not the sun. The last 3 days of creation take place on Earth. Days 5 and 6, the creation of man. What happened on the 5th day of creation? My hypothesis number 16, this is covered in verses 20 through 23. God created 2 types of sea life, the monsters of the sea, which I'm saying are the whales, and things that swarm. So that would be fish that swarm and creepy things that swarm, such as plankton and shrimp. On the 5th day, God also created birds that fly above the firmament of the heavens. Later in verse 30, God describes that the birds that fly eat every green plant for food. So it's not birds that eat fish or eat meat. There is no mention of birds that swarm on day 5. Therefore, the birds that fly above the firmament of the earth, who do not swarm and eat every green plant for food, my hypothesis, were the flying dinosaurs, such as pterodactyls. Section 16. What happened on the 6th day of creation? And finally, we're going to get the creation of man. My hypothesis number 17. This is covered in verses 24 through 31. God created cattle. I've mentioned before, oxen for tilling, cows for milk, leather, and beef. And God gave dominion to man over the cattle. So that matches. God created the creeping things. Verse 25, that would be up in the sea and the dirt. God gave man dominion over creeping things that creep on the earth, not things that creep in the sea. God did not give man dominion over creeping things that also swarm in the sea. God created the beasts of the earth in verse 25, which I'm saying are horses, elephants, hippopotami, rhinoceros, which eat every green plant for food. But God did not give man dominion over the beasts of the earth. And that's in verse 26. Remember, that's part of the lie. God gave man dominion over fish in the sea. But remember that God only created fish that swarm in chapter 1. So this would be fish that can be caught with nets. And remember that these fish had been created on day 4. God also gave man dominion over birds of the air, which had also, remember, the birds had also been created on day 4. The dominion over birds, why did man give us dominion over birds of the air? And since we don't eat them, my hypothesis is that God gave us dominion for directions of transport. So we watch the pterodactyls, look where they're flying, to go for water, to go for shelter. And we can ride them. We can tell them to take us somewhere. The dominion over the creeping things of the earth, and that does not include flying insects, that God gave us man dominion so we don't have to worry about digging up the earth and disturbing them. We can go ahead and disturb them since we have dominion over the earth. And I'm going to finish up this final section, or this final part, with a discussion of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And I'm going to start this discussion by talking about creation and destruction. And this is my hypothesis number 18. As part of the cycle of life, all living and non-breathing entities are constantly created and ultimately destroyed. Destruction is a necessary part of the cycle. Destruction has to occur. God, male, is the commander of the creation process. Satan, female, is the commander of the destruction process. God and Satan cannot exist without each other. God and Satan are opposite ends of the same life force. They exist together. This life force I'm going to talk about, I call it ether. The 4 elements available to assist in the creation and destruction processes are earth, air, fire, and water. Section 18, what is the element earth? My hypothesis number 19, a close equivalent of the element earth is dirt. Element earth also consists of formerly breathing entities that have stopped breathing. So once something dies, it becomes part of the earth. What is element air? Section 19, my hypothesis number 20, the element air is most accurately described in today's terminology as ether, E-T-H-E-R, also sometimes spelled A-E-T-H-E-R. To Star Wars fans, that would be a combination of the Force and the dark side of the Force. This air is not to be confused with the air that we breathe, which is oxygen for animals, carbon dioxide for plants. It's not equivalent to the element air, but the air that we breathe is the foundation for the energy exchange required for the element air. So the air that we breathe, the oxygen, is the foundation of the element air that exists all around us, the force that flows through everything. What is the element fire? Section 20. Fire is the cleansing agent for the element earth. So dead plant and animal forms should be burned for proper cleansing. What is the element water? My section 21, my hypothesis number 2. The element water is the cleansing agent for animal forms that breathe. The element water, it does not cut off the element air, the ether. There's still a life force going through the ether, but it does cut off the air that we breathe. The oxygen. Baptism, complete but temporary submersion in water, is a proper way to cleanse a soul. Section 22, how do the 4 elements relate to each other? My hypothesis 23, animal life forms that breathe undergo creation, which is blue, and destruction, which is red. Arteries are blue, veins are red, sky is blue, the sea is blue. The element water is the proper cleansing agent for animal life forms that breathe. Plant life forms also undergo creation, which is green, and destruction, which is yellow or orange. The element fire is the proper cleansing agent for all life forms, or former life forms that no longer breathe, in other words, dead animals. Animals that no longer breathe are considered just like dead plants to the universe. The element earth, dirt, is brown. White, gray, and black are neutral colors. and are assigned to functions that can be used for creation or destruction. And finally, to finish up this entire video, what is evil? My hypothesis number 24, evil, which many know is alive, spelled backwards, is the abomination of destruction. The use of the element fire to cleanse breathing life forms is an abomination. To hold something underwater to cut off the breathing so that it dies and is no longer life form, that is also an abomination. So those would be evil. That is the end of the big lie in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. I'm Roger Raynard, and I'm going to finish it up with my standard Rock Reynolds departure. Rap with you later.